This is episode 144. Those of you who are watching me on YouTube and are wondering why am I wearing a hat, a winter hat, it is because it's a Coolie Duty Farm winter hat. And that means that I actually was on the farm and I was talking with our friend James Foley. James is a farmer, he's a dairy farmer, and he's running this regenerative farming operations. But more importantly, James managed to cut all chemical nitrogen inputs. And this is very interesting because nitrogen in farming hit the headlines a couple of months back. And it seems like it will hit the headlines again, this time in Ireland. So I guess that's a very timely episode. And we talked with James about various farming practices, but also how he get to the point where he can get away without any chemical nitrogen inputs, and whether this is better or worse, and what benefits it has for the biodiversity and such. We covered a lot of topics other than obvious one about the nitrogen inputs, but we also talked about multi-species pasture, about pasture-fed, grass-fed beef. We talk about various farming practices. We talk about perception of farming in the social media. We talk about methane emissions, the whole deal. Excellent conversation, very educational, and especially for all of you farmers out there. I'm sure there are a few farmers who are listening to this podcast. But even if you're not interested in farming in terms of actually farming, and you're just interested in the biodiversity and the environment, well, that's an episode for you as well. James is dropping knowledge bombs all the time, and he also is sharing his huge experience. He's very well read and very well educated in terms of what he does, and he was gracious enough to share all that knowledge with you through my podcast. So I'm sure you will enjoy this episode. And as always, I am encouraging you to subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show. Subscribe to the newsletter. In the newsletter, there's a lot of additional informations and a lot of additional stuff that is not in the podcast, like links to the articles that you can research the subjects we talk about on the podcast further, and some other news. For example, in this edition of the newsletter, there is my summary of the Sea Monitor Straits conference I had a pleasure to attend. Anything that's environmentally important is in my newsletters. The link is in the description of the show, so go in there and subscribe. So folks, that's it for this introduction. I'm not going to be dragging this any longer. And enjoy the podcast. James, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Tommy. Pleasure.
And my pleasure. Thanks for invitation. It was great to be, guided around the farm. You've shown me a lot of things, and I think we're gonna create some more material out of that. But for now, just sit down here for a podcast. It's the first podcast in like over a year, face to face.
Yeah, it's been a strange time, but yeah, nice to be opened up again properly, and meeting people face to face. It's a novelty now.
It's very good. Listen, let's jump right into it. We're on your farm. You're a farmer. Do you think that farming is the biggest threat to biodiversity? What's your view on this?
Well, in some ways, I suppose, like it's a lot of the land area, like really, so what happens on the farming area itself, we can be a threat or we can be positive as well. But I suppose over the last few years, where a lot of farms would be, say grain or whatever, they'd be growing one crop versus, like, we'll say a natural ecosystem would be multiple crops and multiple different types of plants and animals or whatever. What happens in farming, you're farming one plant or one cow or one sheep or whatever. A lot of the time, anyway, that's the way it's gone. But yeah, no, I think we can kind of move with the times now again, and kind of have more biodiversity on our farms, as against, like, we know there is a problem out there, and we just kind of need to kind of address it a little bit,
Yeah, and this is what you're trying to do on your farm.
Yeah, well, I suppose we started from like I would say just to we're in organic conversion, we're a dairy farm, and we've over the last few years we kind of started with the whole idea was to kind of cut our costs, and we've got one of the bigger bills on our farm was nitrogen. And it's it's still the case in most farms. We don't use any chemical nitrogen anymore, but it was it's a big input, and we kind of started from that point of view that recycling of nutrients or whatever on our farm, very little actually leaves in milk and meat as such in terms of minerals and all that kind of stuff. But we kind of figured that there has to be another way to farm and hold on to these things and not be buying in all these inputs. And we figured we were doing something wrong, so we tried to kind of find the solutions for that. And I suppose since the opening up of social media and everything else, we're seeing farmers doing different things all over the world, and we're kind of and scientists as well doing different things, interesting things that kind of play into kind of understanding all of this as well. But on the farm itself, we're trying to buy in less inputs than ever before, and that's a cost thing, first and foremost. But the biodiversity and all these things, like, I mean, they can be a secondary thing as such, but because on a farm you have to make money first, but we're kind of hoping we can do that over the next few years.
Yeah. So how would you describe the different, like how different your practices are compared, because I'm presuming they're different compared to like a mainstream farming, if there is even such a thing. So if you can tell us, like how different that is compared to what's I don't know again what the term is, whether it's a mainstream farming or like
conventional farmer.
Conventional farming. Yeah. That's the word I was using.
I have heard it described that it does nothing conventional about it, because if you're talking about conventional, you'd be taking in the last hundreds and hundreds of years, and that I suppose you could call it a chemical farming system or what have you. But look, I suppose in some ways what we're doing is actually almost the same as what we were doing before, but what we're kind of managing the land a little bit differently. What we've done primarily is we bringing in these multi-species swards and versus the normal monoculture ryegrass. So a multi-species sward is it's a kind of a mixture of different plants, which would be kind of more like you have in a wild ecosystem. So we have legumes, herbs, and grasses, and I suppose the theory behind it is that when they're all mixed together, they actually grow better than the sum of their parts, and that is what we've been finding. But like there is scientific evidence behind all that as well. It's not just we didn't do it kind of in a wing and a prayer. But as farmers are finding it out from across the world, and that this kind of works. Any kind of polyculture is better than a monoculture for biodiversity. Yeah. The biggest problem, I suppose, is harvesting. If you're talking about wheat and barley and different things like that, you have to kind of, for marketing purposes, you need one thing. But with cows, they can have all these different plants, and it doesn't matter about the marketing. They can just sort it out for themselves, So in terms of, we leave our cows out every day. We move our cows daily or twice daily. That would have been what we were doing before, rotating around our fields and giving it a rest period in between. And, we still have winter housing, we still have slurry, we still have different things like that, like every other farmer or most conventional farmers. But in terms the feeding situation is a little bit different, because we're not putting the fertilizers out now that we were on our grassland, and we're kind of it seems to be going well so far anyway. We've been at it for 4 or 5 years now. For listeners' benefit,
is this, so this is like a pasture fed cow? Like, can you explain, like, because of a lot of people who are tuning into this, they know very little about farming, and I suppose they hear in the social media and everywhere different various things about farming and farmers. And this is part of a discussion we had today, which is one of the benefits of being able to record offline. We can meet and hang out and have a chat off record. So we were talking about this, like that people here often things about farming practices, relation to biodiversity, and then like one person said it, and then another repeated, and then another repeated, and then all of a sudden it becomes like a mantra, and everybody's repeating one thing without even knowing what they're talking about. So can you tell us, like, what is this the grass fed? Is it like, what are the differences? And if it's not grass fed, what it can be, and so on.
Yeah, we, apart from, we call it, what we're growing in our fields, we call it pasture rather than grass, because there's a lot more than just grass species in there. But in terms of what is kind of grass fed, you have to have there's a certain standard, but we're not really adhering to that in general. You know, there's not a, like in organic, we'll say you have a certain set of rules or whatever. I know for marketing purposes, there is a definition of grass fed. I think they more so do it in the States. But like I would say, most farmers in Ireland now would be, you know, most of the diet of the cow would be coming from grass out in the field, and they would be saving some silage from that grass, and they'd probably be buying in some sort of cereals or something to help with, you know, just balance up with the diet or whatever, to finish their animals, or with milking cows to help with a little bit more production or whatever. And we would still be not much different than that end of things. But we do grow some of our other crops that for our silages, not just our pasture silages. We've been growing grain on our outside blocks, which is kind of partly the you know, the reason behind it is because I would say when you feed a grain, you know, you do get good performance in your daily gains of cattle and milk yields and that kind of stuff, especially in the winter. So we on our outside blocks, we've been growing crops like peas, barley and oats mixed together, and you know, they don't need any sprays. There's a legume in there that fixes the nitrogen, and you just cut it once a year, and you know, it's easier for silage making or whatever when you're only cutting once a year, especially when you have a bit of distance to travel with so that's a kind of an economic thing. But since we're moving towards organic, we're trying to cut down as much as we can on the bought in feed, whether that's silages or, you know, we have bought in maize or beet or sugar beet, that kind of stuff off other farmers before. We're going to have to kind of cut down on that, because from here on we're going to have to buy only organic feed if we're buying any feed. But it's kind of it's more of a case of trying to get to a little bit more self-sufficient on the farm. So, you know, it isn't the worst thing in the world to have grain in a cow's diet or whatever, but it's you know, I kind of feel it's when you have a mixture of plants and a proper mixture in the diet itself, you're going to get the richness in the flavors and all that in your milk and meat when you have a mixture rather than just one. You know, you could technically have grass fed from a single species of grass, and that wouldn't be very rich, and you know, a very rich diet for a cow. And you know, you could get within the grass fed kind of limitations or whatever, the standards, we'll say. Yeah. The standards for what would be counted as being grass fed. I think they say 90% of the diet has to be grass, but you could get within that and still not be, you know, you could be using a lot of nitrogen, and you know, it's not necessarily a natural diet, you know, really natural diet. And that would be what someone I would reckon that a consumer would be expecting, you know, a real natural diet if they're talking about buying grass-fed meat, you know. So it's a complicated answer and a complicated question. You know, there's nothing simple in the way things are labelled, and, you know, whether it's organic or conventional or whatever, you know, there's you know, every farm actually does different things as well. So to box everything up into one package and you know, say that this is, you know, a certain product, you know, like Kerrygold, or even like the the cheeses from the south of France and Italy and all them. Some of them actually have set specific practices that they can do on farm, but nobody else from outside the region can make that.
Yes.
So, you know, those are the type of things that actually probably would be a good idea economically point of view and marketing point of view. But at the moment, you know, what we'd be doing 4 or 5 years time probably be a little bit different than what we're doing now.
Yeah. So the practice evolves kind of over time.
Yeah, and as we learn more, you know, we're learning from other farmers all the time. There's something to pick up from every farm as to what they're doing. You know, every farmer is doing something probably better than anyone else, and there's always things you can pick up on, and it's just a case of kind of just watching out for things and keeping your mind open to new things, and maybe there's a better way we can do it. You know.
Well, you said that you started you started on this journey. It was kind of like motivated with financially with the inputs and having less inputs and so on. But what was the moment where you knew this is going to work? Did you know from the very beginning that, yep, this is the right thing and it's going to work and we're going to be successful? Or was it like you tried and then when you tried, like what was this moment when you were convinced that it would work?
The first time we planted one of these multi-species swards was in 2018, but we've been looking at it. I'm farming with my father and mother and my wife, Clodagh, and you know, we've been. You don't just make a decision on a farm most of the time, just yourself. So we've been talking about this since much longer ago than that, 4 or 5 years previous to that. We're looking at things and seeing guys on YouTube doing things and kind of said, that's interesting, but would it work here? And, you know, we eventually plucked up the courage in 2018 to plant a field. And at first, you know, it was normally when you're putting in a grass field, you spray off any other plants, and you can't do that with a multi-species sward because they're all different herbs and whatever else, and there's no herbicide that can take out all the other weeds. So we're kind of left with if there was weeds going to come up, we weren't going to be able to do anything about them really. And from the first, you know, what we would call weeds, you know, docks are one of them that were always a problem in grassland, and they started to come up that very first planting, and after a while I didn't see them anymore. They were out competed by the other herbs that we had in the mix, because in a normal grassland situation, docks are a very deep rooted plant, and they normally have a free run at it in a normal perennial ryegrass pasture. Once they get established, they go below the root zone and there's no competition at all. So that's why you often see a lot of docks in grasslands. And so we weren't seeing that as much. But like, you know, I'd say I was terrified. I was terrified that my father was like, what are you doing here? You know, the whole field is full of weeds. You know? Yeah, like he was on board enough, but at the same time, you know, where none of us are above criticism of ourselves but you know, of each other. And like if we're doing something that doesn't work out and you thought it might work out, you know, you have to be able to defend it. And if you couldn't defend it to your own folks, then, you know, you know, I suppose that's kind of, you know, you have that anytime you're trying something new, you're going to have that. Yeah. And
but I guess the ultimate defense of it is in the balance sheets at the end of the year.
Yeah, it is like, so if just say, for example, you have got some weeds in this new setup, whereas you're used to having a really clean kind of a lawn look about the farm, you know, you kind of, you know, even it is a little bit messier looking, I suppose, compared to what we were used to. It's not like Croke Park anymore, you know.
Yeah, but you know, these perceptions, right? It's like in the lawns as well. Like, oh, it needs to be such a, you know. There's this phrase used, obsession with tidiness. So this is like a little bit of
Oh, I know,
that.
and that's hard to get out of my mind as well as everyone else's mind. That's just it's kind of bet into us from years and years, you know. But we'll say you ultimately, if you have some weeds or whatever, you can appreciate them from the biodiversity end of things anyway. You know, if you're open to that, I suppose. But from the financial point of view, you don't have to care about biodiversity as such. If the thing is performing for you, and if there's enough of pasture there for the cows to eat, and they're milking well or producing the beef or whatever you need to produce, if they're doing that, then you'll get over it, you know.
Yeah.
So that's I'm saying that to guys all the time. It's like biodiversity and all that is actually a secondary benefit of this. This is a business focused idea first for us. Like now, I mean, we love nature and all that. We love birds and the different animals, and it's good. And it's kind of it's like it's kind of an indicator, I suppose, that something good is happening in the soil when you see more birds and you see more worms and what have you. When you're seeing that, you're actually feeling like that, even if it's not already reflected in your financial performance or whatever, you kind of feel like things are going the right way. You know, you just naturally feel that. It's kind of a, you know, if you're in the field with a lot of bees and what have you, versus a really quiet field, you kind of you just feel good.
Yeah,
you know, it just makes you feel better, and that's something that I never thought was going to. I never thought about that.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, like we are here. We're recording this podcast late January. So, but even though it's late January, we went out in the fields, and you can see the difference between you were showing me two fields, one kind of like a monoculture. And one, like you said, there was like a 16 species, they get it right? 12, 16 species of different grasses and herbs and legumes and so on. And it looked like to my eye, the one with the mixed species looked better because there's like more variety, like a leaves and this and that. And again, that's only January. I can only imagine how it's gonna look like in the summer.
It's I kind of, I'm only borrowing a phrase from someone else, but I think with the ryegrass that we've been using over the years, going back, you know, decades, I suppose now, it's like we're farming in a flower pot, you know, and it is like you saw the depth of those roots today.
Yeah,
they just went down a little bit and then they stopped. Nothing then after that. Whereas the other ones they're going down deeper and they're reaching down in there for more moisture and more. They don't need moisture at the moment, but in the summertime, last summer, there was a bit of a drought around here, and the place there greener a lot longer than a lot of the neighbours did. And you know, a lot of the neighbours would have been feeding silage, like same as they would have been in the middle of winter. So they would have been, you know, cutting down what feed they would have had for this winter, and it's a big cost as well. And so resiliency is another thing. Like some of these plants will grow when it's warm, some will grow when it's colder. It doesn't matter what the weather conditions are, something is going to grow well, you know, that it's the sweet spot for them. And you know, and that's aside from the whole benefits to the cow of having a mixed diet, like, you know, like a human diet. Like, you know, we all know we should have a mixture of different things. And you know, I don't even know why we thought it would be a good idea, you know, going back to years, why would we thought that one plant would have been the best plant, why only one plant? But look, there's reasons behind it, but we got to a stage where we never knew any different than, it didn't even come into our minds about growing mixtures of different plants. Just didn't even come into our minds because that wasn't what was going on in the colleges and whatever, the agricultural training.
I think it's coming more and more. I think it's coming more and more now with the soil health and because what's fascinating is that this all kind of like is all intertwined, right? There's financial aspect of this, all right, but then there is a biodiversity and the soil and the nutrients in the soil, and then circulating that into the actual animals, into the quality of the meat and quality of the milk and all that, and I guess your soil. Let's talk about soils. Like, I presume that these soils are much higher quality, and in those multi-species fields.
No, we haven't tested them as such, but like anything, any research I've seen about it, the carbon storage in these soils when the roots are deeper, the soils can take in a whole lot more carbon. Now, it's probably cycling carbon, but it's more of it in the soil at any one time. And, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's not doing anything for us up there, but if it's in the soil and if it's in a microbe or something else that's been eaten by another microbe, and that's all feeding into the nutrition for our plants. And if that's the case, and the more of that you have, the more life you have in your soil, the more there's more carbon, but it's more productive. Yeah. And like most, I suppose an indicator of farm profitability, I've seen studies saying that the more carbon you have in your soil, the more profitable the farm is. Just from the fact that your farm is more productive because it's more nutrients available. And now, I mean, there's the caveat to that is in peat soils you have carbon stored there, but it's in anaerobic conditions, but it's not cycling carbon. But if you're talking about the soils like what we have here, the carbon is pretty much mostly alive. It's just on a microscopic level. But if you're testing it of a day, and if you test it in next year or the year after, you'll probably find that the two fields we looked at today, one of them is significantly higher in carbon than the other one. But look, it's like the biodiversity thing. We're not getting paid for carbon right now. I don't know. It might change.
Is it coming?
Maybe. I mean, there's possibly two sides to that as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to get paid for it. But it's in our interest to have more carbon in our soils.
Yeah.
So why would we not farm for that?
Yeah.
Just or have that in mind as you're trying to kind of design what way you farm, I suppose.
Are your neighbors practicing similar type of farming, or are you just like a one around in the area?
Yeah.
So really, ultimately, where I'm heading with this question is like, what was the reaction of your other farmers, of your neighbors, when you were starting that? It was like, oh, he's completely nuts.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably thought we were nuts, but at the same time, look, our neighbours know us. We get on well with our neighbours, and they're not doing what we're doing. But I feel that, and it's the same world over, and with farms that kind of start off doing something like this at start, there's kind of an early adopters or something. Mm-hmm. It takes a while for most. It could take 20 or 30 years before everyone starts doing what we're doing now, or before the advisory services start taking on board that. It takes a few years to kind of catch up with what the farmers at the cutting edge are doing. Now, and I said to you already, there's probably a lot of things in the farm we're not doing as good as we probably could. But like I said as well, like every farmer's doing something well, but I know we're going the right direction. We're going the right direction, I think, with what we're doing in the line of the long-term kind of profitability in the farm. So, from that end of things, worrying about what the neighbours think isn't top of the agenda at all. But you do have to kind of get a thick skin, I suppose, or not to think about them at all in that way. Only like when they're ready to kind of ask you questions, whatever. Like, I mean, I'm open to, myself and my father, like we talk to anyone. No problem.
Are you talking to me now? Right
talking
now?
To you now, yeah. But we'll talk to people, and I don't think hiding the information and like keeping it close to our chest is going to do us any good in the long run. Mm-hmm. And but yeah, look, I mean, we welcome in anyone. And like, look, I mean, 10 years ago, if we said what we're doing now, we would have said we were mad as well. Ourselves about ourselves. Probably would have, because I hadn't heard any of this stuff,
Right. So it was like a knowledge gap, really.
Yeah, it was completely. Like, I've only come across some of this stuff recently, but there was a lot of there was a lot of research done pre-fertilizers, you know, pre the mass scale fertilizer usage, pre-World War II. And there was a lot known about these mixed species swards, about what the benefits they had at the time. But I suppose once World War II came, there was a cheap source of nitrogen, and there was in the UK and in Europe, I suppose, there was an almost starvation there after the war. For the 5 or 6 years after the war, there was rations in Ireland, and the nitrogen did come in handy that time because the soils had been, there was compulsory tillage. So these soils, you know, they would have had a fertility in the grassland, but when they ploughed them up, then they were using up all that nitrogen. And when they got this, this cheap amendment to the soil, and they got huge responses in the crop yields. It was economic, and nobody knew what the long term effects would be. But
was that true that there was the nitrogen was produced for the military needs, for the war effort, and there were like a massive factories producing a lot of the nitrogen, and it was kind of like a sort of coincidence, like, oh, actually, we can still keep producing that and use it in farming.
I think they had used some of these compounds before the war, but it was seen as an opportunity. Yeah, they had all the factories for making the bombs, and nitrogen and phosphorus and all them. They're that's what they use for bombs. So So I suppose it was a cheap thing. There was a population that were nearly hungry, or on starvation. So it wasn't a bad thing at the time. It was, the long-term consequences weren't known about. Now, at the same time, there was some soil scientists that said, look, I mean, this should be a short-term usage, and but the way funding works for agricultural research, it kind of meant that any kind of high input kind of a setup, when who was sponsoring the universities and what have you, so that's kind of when we were on a kind of a cusp of understanding how nature creates its own nitrogen and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's not that we didn't know anything about it, but we were kind of close to kind of understanding what we needed to do to make our soils more fertile naturally. And but all that knowledge got kind of forgotten for 70, 80 years. And it's been researched again now, but if you actually look back far enough, some of that research has already been done close on 100 years ago.
Yeah. Well, listen, we talked about on the podcast many times about the, like you said, scientific process, and science is also not ideal, not perfect, and quite often, like you said, there are interests, or even nothing sinister, but there's like more funding or more interest in some other area, and that's what's getting researched, and that's where the things are going.
Well, there's in the last few years there's been an uptick in knowledge about soils. And like when I was in college, we had modules on soil science, but the biology end of it wasn't really being kind of pushed home, I suppose. It was the chemical and the physical, and whether compaction or just NPK, nitrogen, whatever. And so that was the way soils were taught at that time. It was incredibly boring. Whereas now it's there's been advances in microscopes and different DNA technology for understanding what actual microbes are there and what have you. But a lot of that work was done in the kind of the pure sciences, and they would have probably been government funding. But what's happening now is basically scientists are able to tell you what's happened. Like farmers are already doing things; they're showing things are happening on the ground. But the scientists are now only now able to actually explain them, to any degree. So, but the fact that we weren't able to connect with farmers that were doing kind of wild things, I suppose. One farmer might be doing one thing and he wouldn't know about another farmer or another place, and putting it all together would have been difficult, impossible, I suppose.
Yeah. James, like, would you say, what are the biggest barriers for farmers to start doing what you're doing, meaning having pastures that are multi-species? We can talk about soil compaction as well, because that was one other difference that you showed me between these two fields, that the soil is much less compacted. So when you're talking about it, it seems like it's a no-brainer. It's just like why everybody doesn't do that. So what are the barriers you think for other farmers to go ahead and proceed?
Well, I'd say that there's a knowledge gap. Like even the advisory services don't know a lot about it.
Oh, really?
They've been researching recently, but what you can do in a trial is a lot different than what we can do. We can make a call on the farm and say, right, okay, I can see the difference. I don't necessarily have to measure it exactly, but I can see a difference almost straight away. Then whereas an advisory service has to go and actually measure everything, and before they can before they can give the advice that we need to go this way or something, so they actually have to measure everything, and that could take 10 years. And only then, that's knowledge transfer and all that kind of stuff. That takes a while as well. But the biggest thing is, like, we kind of, I suppose, we went over to England, and a lot of farmers over there had been kind of taking this on long before us. There would be Cotswold Seeds would be seed company over there that we got the first seeds from. They would have knowledge going back 30 years probably. About all these different mixtures of seeds and whatever, and I don't know how they held on to the knowledge, but they had the knowledge there long before us. So we went over and we visited farms in England, and we saw it on the farm. So it's one thing having it in theory and knowing it and seeing it on YouTube or whatever, but actually seeing it in the field, it's kind of like, the easiest way, it's just seeing is believing, I suppose. Like, when you can actually see it, it's kind of hard to knock it on the head then, so it's a case of farmers. I know there's a lot of farmers have put in an acre to 5 acres in the last 2 years. And, most of them have gone on pretty well. And from there, they're not fools. Like, they're not going to just reseed all the farm in 1 year. Because that wouldn't be, you'd be taking a big risk if it didn't work, if you didn't know that it worked.
Yeah.
So it just takes a bit of time to get through to, I suppose we started off in 2018, so it's 5 years later now. I wouldn't be doing the same thing now that I would have done in 2019.
Oh.
Because, now we have a bit more experience.
What would you do differently?
Know. Well, I suppose we would have probably seeded more quicker, that would have been it. But that wouldn't have been the right thing to do, because we weren't sure at the time.
Yeah.
But now we are. And
hindsight always 2020.
Yeah, but like, it's like growing fruit trees or something like that. Like, we have a handful of apples and different things outside there, and like, it'd be fine to say we'd put them all in the first year, but like, whether it's varieties or actually learning how to actually grow them and prune them and everything else, probably better off have a small few first before you go into having thousands of trees or whatever, So it does make sense not to change everything too quickly always. You're better off to kind of take it step by step, but like, there is a lot of farmers in Ireland now have a field or two of a multi-species mix. Now, I suppose some of them are probably 5 or 6 species. I kind of don't reckon that's enough to get the real benefits. But it's a lot better than just one species. And also another thing would be some of them are actually still spreading nitrogen on those.
No.
And it's really no benefit, and actually doesn't the herbs and the clovers don't really do so well when there's nitrogen being spread on them, because they're not actually really all adapted to getting nitrogen on them. And even the clover, it kind of doesn't really fix any nitrogen when there's nitrogen available. So it favors the grass, and then you end up with all grass anyway at the end if you go that way. So there is a little bit of, there is a few tips and things to learn, all right, but and like, there's a lot of things we don't know as well. And we're hoping to kind of find out over the next few years what's a better ways of managing it, even,
Yeah. So how would you describe your practice? Is it like regenerative farming, or is it to describe it? I heard that there's term no dig, but it's probably something else.
Like no dig and regenerative farming. And I suppose one thing we can say is we've signed up to be organic, but you possibly, you might be doing a lot of tillage every year, and usually that's not seen as being regenerative. Trying to leave the soil intact as much as you can would be normally, I suppose the network of air and water flow through the soil works better if it's kind of left there a bit longer, A single plant for 1 year won't be able to make roots as deep as a perennial plant. So the soil structure won't be as good if you're ploughing or something every year. But regenerative, I suppose, we're trying to farm regeneratively, I suppose. Whether I call myself a regenerative farmer, I just call myself a farmer, because, in the end of it, like, that's what we are. Whether you call ourselves regenerative or not, we're trying to be regenerative, I suppose. But to call ourselves regenerative maybe might be presuming too much, maybe. But the general idea of regenerative farming is that you kind of farm more like in nature's biomimicry or whatever, farm more in nature, in the way nature does it. Which would be, you don't leave a soil bare. You never have a soil bare. You have roots that are living in the ground all the time. You have a diversity of plants and animals, grazing animals. And, I might have left something out there, but, you can be regenerative and be not completely organic, I suppose.
Yeah.
You could allow yourself the possibility to use a chemical once in a while.
Yeah. Can you explain, like, in the simple terms, like, why putting all those inputs like nitrogen and others depletes the soil? Why does it leave the soil? Yeah.
I think part of it is the rooting depth isn't enough to hold onto the soil, to hold onto the nutrients. So that, just say in that field of the ryegrass that you're in, once if the nitrogen is in the top few inches, then the roots might be able to hold on to it. But once it goes below that, then it's gone. It's just going to leach, and that might take a bit of time. But a lot of the chemical nitrogen, it's fairly volatile. It's the most volatile fertilizer we have, in that it can go into the atmosphere or the rivers very, very easily. It's very water soluble, and a lot of time with nitrogen, if you don't have an actively growing plant, you could have more than half it end up in the atmosphere or the river. So a lot of the time, even if you are going to stay putting nitrogen on, putting it on at a time when there's actual growth is important, and that's not always what's been advised over the years. A lot of the nitrogen was being put out in January, and when there's no growth, and then there could be snow or there could be frost, and a lot of that's going to be lost. So efficiency wise, just from the farming economics point of view, you don't want to do that, but that's what was kind of being sold as what we should do. So that, that has to change now, because the rivers aren't great, and there is greenhouse gas emissions from nitrogen as well. Nitrous oxide is something like 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas.
Oh.
And so you don't want to waste that money either. So it's a kind of and look, there's a lot of fuel used up in making nitrogen as well. There's it's mostly made with natural gas, and it's the Haber-Bosch process is, I think they need 600 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
They can't really do it with electricity, so they can't get that kind of heat. So they have to use gas, and there's a lot of that escaping into the atmosphere as well. That's methane, like, and so it's a very costly process. Like, it needs oil, it needs gas, and then you're losing a lot of it, and then there's greenhouse gas emissions from it as well. So, there's a lot of costs there, like, in the long run, if you can make the nitrogen on your farm just using plants, and they can do it at room temperature, they can
makes
do it at
sense,
normal temperatures. They need high pressures as well to make this nitrogen. To the Haber-Bosch pressure needs high pressure.
Yeah.
You can do you can make nitrogen at normal temperatures and at low pressure, and without any problems.
And take care of biodiversity.
You can do all those things. Look, like I said already, it's a win. It is a win-win. It's just going to take a bit of time to kind of get everyone on board as to why it works. Because I think you need to understand it a bit. Understand what's going on as well. Can't just be told something works and just believe it.
Yeah.
You kind of need to understand what it is. And
I presume there are people who will just say, like, yeah, but for me, it will never work because...
Yeah.
Right?
We can all come up with excuses as to why things won't work. And,
people don't like change. Is that the part of it? Is that the part of that? Like, it kind of works, so why would it be... I
suppose there is a few criticisms, right, of the actual plants that we're growing. Oh. Some of them don't last overly long. I suppose, they would be agriculturally bred plants, for whatever reason. They would have been growing chicory for forest chicory. They would have been growing them in monocultures, probably. But some of them don't last that long. I think partly it's a management issue, but partly as well because they may not be adapted to our climate as well as other plants, So, like, ideally, I would say, if we could use native plants, ones that we know work very, very well. You see them in the hedgerows. You see birds foot trefoil and different types of vetches, and I don't know the names of all of them, but you see plants that are growing in the hedgerow that aren't growing 5 yards into the field. And if ideally, like we say, if you're in a mountain or whatever, you're not going to be putting plants that grow well in the lowlands in France or someplace, and that's what the seeds we're using. So, but a lot of the plants are native. I suppose they would be growing here naturally, but they're improved agricultural varieties. So, if you're talking about biodiversity, you should really be talking about the diversity of the actual seeds themselves as well. So, like, but I kind of see it as planting a multi-species sward. I see it as kind of the first step in creating the natural diversity on your farm, and then over a longer term, hopefully not having to put these seeds in at all, that they will regenerate themselves and seed themselves over time.
Right.
So that does take a slightly different management than what we've been doing before.
Yeah. What would you say is the next? What would be the next step to take it even further? Is it like wood pastures? There was a lot of talk about wood pastures as well, and stuff like that. So, knowing what you know now, what you're expecting to be the next step.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's a big push on to get more forestry and all that, and even on farms, working farms or whatever. And I think there is room for a lot more trees on farms, and on our farm, like, it's fairly open. So, like, the biggest issue with having when you put in some trees on a farm like this is shelter for the animals, and so, like, whether it's a hot day, a windy day, a cold day, whatever, that'll help the animal performance. And, like, that's, we naturally know that, but it's just been, most hedgerows are cut very, very harshly. Now, there's a reason for it when you do it on the roadside. You do need to have the road safe or whatever. But the internal hedgerows are probably you know, they're cut back very, very regularly and very severely, and they won't do a whole lot for you in either biodiversity or in shelter. You know, now the practical implications are that you need an electric fence wire. If you're to manage your animals properly, you need to be moving your animals regularly. When you have a hedgerow that's expanding and expanding without cutting it back a little bit, you're going to have, their electric fence isn't going to work anymore, because there's going to be little leaders and little shoots and little bits and pieces coming up and hitting the wire and taking out the electric fence wire. So it's easy to say just, don't touch them anymore, but like there does need to be some kind of management of them. But there is solutions to that too, like, you know, so because the cows will eat a good bit under the wire, they could probably reach 3 or 4 feet in under the wire, maybe at least. And you can actually bring your wire out further out, so that if you do occasionally hedge cut the field, you can actually keep control of that reasonably, just so that the wire is working. And because otherwise you're going to have to keep moving your wire in, and you're in the mid, and eventually you just got a tiny field in the center. You know, you don't really have any pasture anymore. But I'd say like the amount of trees grow well. A lot of trees grow well when they've got more sunlight than they have when they're inside in the middle of a forest. And I've a neighbour who's very into his trees, but he's kind of living in a kind of a wood that he planted all the trees himself. They're not conifers or anything like that. But the trees are very, very tall, but very, very narrow. And like, to me, they're reaching up for light. They're not the healthiest of trees. Like, you know, the best trees I see are the ones that have loads of room around them, and you know, they're reaching out over into a field of grass or something. And it's not necessarily a bad thing for the grass either, because from the calculations, I've seen some calculations out there that you can actually, if you have one large tree in every acre, along with some lower, you know, bush type kind of trees that are a little bit lower down in a hedgerow, you can actually have up to 3 times more photosynthesis than if you just have a simple monoculture, whether that's a forest monoculture or a grass monoculture. There's actually more light, more surface area. So now, like, you know, in terms of us commercializing the trees or cutting the trees, having it inside in a narrow forest, the trees grow straighter and they're easier to make for timber. So whether we bother even trying to make our trees straight so that we could sell them for timber sometime is probably debatable. So in terms of, like, there is a cost to planting trees and managing them. It's just that the direct cost back, or the money back, isn't seen directly. It's seen probably more so in saved money rather than actual money into your pocket from a sale from that little bit of land. But I don't see it as being a huge problem, because most of the plants that we have can survive in something like more than 50% shade and not have any problem with that. And actually they might even benefit from having shelter from colder weather or wind or whatever. So, and you know, you've also have leaf fall as well. So, like, we'd say at the moment now, in the fields now where all the leaves are after falling, the grass that's there now would have almost 100% of the light that's coming, and until those leaves come on in April or May or whatever, April I suppose, or depending on the tree, there'll be, most of the light will be getting through to the ground, and by the time you get to summer, a lot of those, there'll be a lot more sunlight obviously, but these plants, they can't even take up that sunlight. It bounces off them and what have you. They're not really designed to take full sun anyway.
Are you going to be planting trees next?
We're planting all of it. We're planting the last 5 or 6 years, but they're just not high enough for you to see them yet, really.
Right. No, but I mean, like, you saw those pictures where there's cattle grazing in the, you know, between the trees, and there's like some even heavy machinery harvesting, but there are like a row of trees on the both sides, those sort of things. Is that the picture you have in mind when you're picturing your farm, like 10 years from now?
I think it would probably take longer than that, but I think it's like I was saying earlier about knowing what the next step is. Like, when I knew, if I could go back then, that'd be great. But I actually don't know exactly what's the best layout of trees or what way to plant them. I suppose my knowledge wouldn't be brilliant on trees. But there isn't a lot of other reference points out there for people doing this with trees, in Ireland anyway. There is a research place in the north of Ireland, I think, that has this setup of, it's kind of like a park system really, where you have grass underneath these nice trees. They're probably trees that probably will grow straight. I suppose there is ones there that will grow straight even if they're on their own. And they do say that they get a higher production overall.
No.
And they have the trees as well, So, but like, we don't want all those types of trees either. We want a mixture of everything really, I suppose, because I suppose, look, we could use it for firewood as well over time. And I suppose, it's not something in theory, 100% that's the way we should be going. I just don't know, are we there yet? I suppose.
Like
to commercialize to actually get commercial good use out of the tree and still have your biodiversity as well. That's the difficult part, to actually commercialize it.
Like you mentioned, you're ultimately, you're not running research and development here, you're running business here. So you cannot afford just to risk too much. You need to weigh the risk that you're taking versus.
You can do a small bit of research within, but you can't do it all. And and look, I mean, some people have more interest in certain types of trees, and some people are more interested in trees and taking care of them. I'm probably more interested in milking cows and that kind of stuff. So, like, I mean, I'm sure you could do. I know there's farmers in England that are they have apples and they have grain. And it seems to work well. And the biggest issue with growing any line of trees here is that it has to be fenced off until they're big enough that can handle a cow. And it could take a while. Like, that could take 10 years really. And even at that, they could severely damage the tree. When they're small, if there's any little mistake made, then the whole lot of trees could be eaten in one night. When they're small, So I have a few fruit trees just outside the front there, and like, that's fine. They're as close to the house, and but I've been trying to manage them with electric fence wire, and it is difficult because it was one particular day with the horse in and some heifers in there as well. And the horse was eating over the wire, and the other ones were eating under the wire. And I was trying to keep the wire back far enough, but not too far back, because you don't want too much grass growing up around the bottom of the tree. You want to clear it a little bit. And it's like, because we don't have a lawnmower here. I don't want to be working lawnmowers that much. I want to try and graze everything I can when I have the animals that can do it. But like, in some cases, you might be better off just to fence the thing off for a few years. Listen, James. You're obviously very well read, and you're researching this stuff. You're learning all the time, and you're also very aware of the overall picture with biodiversity and with farming and climate change, water quality, all these things we discuss. And like we said, we have probably material for like at least 5 other podcasts if we wanted to kind of dive deep on everything that we touched on when we were discussing this off the record today. Listen, like, overall, in your view, do you feel like in a popular, let's say, media, the farming is sometimes or often misrepresented or represented unfairly? And then follow-up question to that is, do you feel like some of that is there's reasons for some of that, and then practices like yours and similar regenerative farming, woodland pasture, all these things
are really the things we should look for to have a better biodiversity, improve the image of farming, and carry on. What's your views on this whole situation?
Yeah, I suppose it's a big enough question because most of the time I think that in the, let's say, representation of farming in the media, a lot of it comes down to actually animal welfare and that kind of stuff, which if you're farming regeneratively and you're doing all that really well, you would still could have the same sort of issues thrown at you, like in terms of like, oh, I mean, you know, eating meat and maybe we shouldn't be eating meat and humanely slaughtering animals and these kind of things. They would be things that I would be, I don't know, would I be concerned about them, or just, I do think that some of the time it's not a balanced picture in the media. Now, at the same time, I wouldn't shy away from the fact that there is problems, and there is water quality problems, and there's profitability problems on farms as well. So, like, they're all, you know, if we can solve something by, you know, it's not a magic bullet as such, but it's as close as you're going to get to one by having enough diversity on your farm. I think it's just you know, we do need to move that way. And so, like, what's holding us back is, you know, there's a few issues, I suppose, but you know, I do feel that, I suppose, the media landscape is fairly simplistic in everything. So it's a soundbite. Like, I'd find it hard to explain to you in 5 minutes what we're doing, you know, never mind having 20 or 30 seconds, you know, on the news in the nighttime. So, you know, so like, I suppose there's a few things that I would say are possibly being misrepresented in the media. I'd say methane is probably one of them. Yeah. I think, like, I mean, there's no doubt that methane is part of what a cow produces. Like, you know, like, you see, the two sides to the story are that methane is part of digestion. It's the natural part of digestion. It's actually produced by microbes that break down the likes of cellulose in the plant. And say, like, the likes of horses are not ruminants. They can't actually break some of them things down. That ultimately, in the longer term, if you have grass just thrown out on the ground after being cut, that you are likely to have methane produced from that anyway, whether it is cut or eaten by a cow. And because it's just the CO2 bacteria, whatever, aren't able to break these products down, is, you know, it's like there's a role in the ecosystem for methane because of, you know, there's the whole class of bacteria that make methane and eat methane, and it's just part of a cycle. It's just like we take in food and we put out CO2. We take in oxygen, we put out CO2. There's other things that do the reverse, which are mostly plants. And methane, there's a cycle of animals or little microbes that do put out methane and take it in. And like, in the warming end of things from methane itself, you know, there isn't a whole lot of acknowledgement that there would have been wild ruminants on Earth long before us, and they didn't cause the planet to warm. Now, I'm not saying the planet isn't warming. What I would be saying is that I don't think the biggest problem is farmed animals as such. They're replacing wild animals probably. Now, look, you could pose the question as to whether there are too many of them in the world at the moment. But it is fairly much accepted that if the ruminant population is the same, then the methane is not going to rise in the atmosphere because it gets broken down after 10 years. So if you have a constant population of ruminants on the planet, then it can't lead to more methane in the atmosphere. But there has been methane spikes in the last you know, since the Industrial Revolution. When you look at it all, most of it's probably coming from fossil fuels and from gas leaks and all that kind of stuff. It's like I was even saying about the nitrogen being made from natural gas. I saw an article there, it's from 2 or 3 years ago, where they were reckoning that there was an under-reporting of natural gas leaks at these sorts of plants that were making the nitrogen of up to 90%. So like there was a whole load of it escaping while they were in the process of making the nitrogen. And that's just nitrogen. Like fracking is another thing. There's loads of, has to be loads of gas escaping. You know, I know it's not a good thing for them economically not to be burning the stuff, you know, just that's being wasted. But that's just what's happening. And it happens, you know, there's natural gas with oil as well, and in oil wells as well. Look, I don't know enough about all the sources, but there's also methane produced from bogs. And it's something that's not really been talked about as well. They're talking about re-wetting in Ireland, and you know, it's an anaerobic environment, and that's where methane is produced. That's where the methane producing bacteria. It's a complicated thing, you see. This is the point. The point is that it's complicated, and there is a natural ecosystem where methane is produced. So are we getting hung up on the wrong thing? That's kind of where I feel we're getting hung up on the wrong thing. I think we need to reduce our pesticide uses. We need to reduce nitrogen. These are the things that are causing probably the most problems in the world, I think. I think we're getting obsessed about methane. I think there's quite a possibility that some of the reasoning behind that is from an agenda of removing animals from our diets and stuff. So they grab onto the one thing that makes them different, and you know, it's a greenhouse gas, and we know it's more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so it's I think it's in the context of farming issues. I think it's a red herring. The methane is. It's not that I think it's not a thing in the atmosphere, but I don't think that the amount of it, but being attributed to animals, is as high as what's, you know, actually happening in the atmosphere.
Yeah, and you know, like to your point, we had a much higher densities of grazing animals, like, you know, the favored by some, the Pleistocene baselines and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
we actually also had a discussion about the woolly mammoth and the like today, and the more focus should be put into, like you said, improving soils and enabling well-functioning ecosystem that can deal and cycle and circulate these gases within itself, rather than going heavy-handed and in a quite limited and narrow way, like, oh, we're gonna remove this, and and what's next. So I think that overall you're painting a picture which, and I don't think that many would disagree, that really farming is a solution to environmental problems that we have, rather than the problem. You know, extremist views aside, because they're always going to be there, right? So let's just starve them of attention and let them die there. But you know, within the conversation that we're taking many factors into the account, I see what you're doing here as a future of farming, and maybe that is kind of like a segue to the question, you know, how, in more detail, how do you see the future of farming playing out? Because on one end you still have this, and you know, let's call a spade, like a powerful lobbies of you know, corporate multinationals trying to sell those chemicals, having big plants, and kind of very much interested in maintaining status quo. On the other hand, you have equal players, which are also big multinational, big food industries, who are jumping on the plant-based agenda, let's call it that way, because that allows them to produce a lot of cheap food, which, you know, it's super highly processed. It's nothing even close to being healthy, but it can have a label like all plant-based. And then it seems like in the middle, the real true solution is like it's in the middle with the farmers like yourself who are just say like, yeah, folks, let's just maintain like a cool heads here.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, longer term. Like, well, I suppose we can't forget that we can't just get away from farming in the medium to long term. Anyway, we have to produce food. You know, it's no good having us starving. Because of, you know, we just have to, and we also have to kind of protect whatever biodiversity we have and improve it as much as we can. So we have to, you know, we can't say, people talking about rewilding and different things, like that's fine, but we still have to produce food as well. So, you know, what I would be suggesting is like, not to say that we don't do rewilding maybe in particular places or whatever, but on the farmed land, you have to farm as close to nature as possible, because you know, longer term we won't be able to afford all of these fossil fuels. Probably they mightn't be there, and you know, we can't. You know, we have to have clean water. So there's so many different things that we have to get right, but you know, demonizing farmers or whatever isn't gonna get us anywhere there, and neither is us kind of talking, you know, too harshly to people that are critical of us as well. We don't want to alienate everybody, you know. But you know, I think that most people can understand that if we can produce food, you know, well, and without using a whole lot of chemicals, that's probably the way to go, you know. And if biodiversity, that's probably the way to go, you know. And you know, like I said, it's going to take a bit of time, but longer term, I think we'll probably look back at there was a lot of madness going on in these years around now.
Difficult times.
Yeah.
Listen, and so are you overall optimistic when you look at the future of farming? Or because there's a lot of farmers who are very worried, you know, with all the regulations that are coming down and this and that. So I'm curious, like you know, aside of the usual amount of uncertainty related to future, which anyone have,
yeah.
But overall, you're looking optimistic. You know, you're optimistic. It's like, yeah, I'm onto something here that I'm comfortable with, or are you worried about the whole farming sector?
I think I'm more optimistic than ever before on farming.
Oh.
Because I think we can produce within our own farm gates most of what we need and sell out rather than be buying in everything. I think we can do that more so than in almost any other industry. Because we'll say, now there is obviously things that at the moment I don't know if there's any solution that are a good solution for us. I mean, just say, for example, the energy for driving our tractors, for harvesting, for milking the cows, or what have you. Like, everyone else has the same problems there in every industry. Plastic, you know, we use plastic for our silage pits, or anytime we're buying a bag of something or other, it's in plastic. I mean, where's that going to end up? What are we going to use to, you know, replace that whenever we do figure out something? Everyone has that problem. But I do think within farming we have, if you have the land, of course, like, but if you've within farming, there is an opportunity to grow without all of the chemicals that we've been using. Most of what we've been doing before, we'll have to farm slightly differently. You'll have to just use your, you know, more of your own initiative, I suppose, than you know, we always had the solution of this product in a jug or a bag that could just get us out of trouble. But we're going to have to plan further ahead or whatever. You know, we have to be a little bit more, I suppose, you know, we can't be on autopilot, I suppose. But I'm more optimistic than ever. I think that a lot of what's been happening over the years is that farmers have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, trying to get economies of scale.
Yes.
And it's not being, like, they think that it's cutting down their input costs and everything else. They might be able to buy a unit 95% as expensive as they were when they were a smaller operator or whatever. But that's the bigger they're getting, the less efficient they're getting in some ways, because they're having to take in so much labor and you know, they're not able to get a real handle on what's going on anymore in the farms. That's been happening over generations, and it's been happening with every industry.
Exactly.
But it's in farming, I think what's actually needed is more people on the land to actually make the micro decisions that are actually the right ones for the farm, because our farm is different than where you're down in Kerry. There's different land down there, we'll say, for planting trees, plant the right trees for there rather than here, or, you know, grassland species for, you know, that kind of stuff. And management, you know, it might be a right bad day, a wet day down there, it might be dry here. You know, there's no blueprint book you can write that'll ever, you know, take the place of what a person on the ground could make a decision on the day. It mightn't be the 100% the right one, but the more people that are there, the more eyes that are on the land, I think that can only be a good thing longer term. Now, am I saying we should be going back to when there was 90% of people on the land? I don't think we should. I do think that you're better off having people that kind of know a lot about what they're doing. You know, I know there's been, you know, it's in the likes of parts of Africa where there was farmers that were on the land that got fired out, and fellas that came from the city and they took over the land, didn't know the first thing about how to farm. You know, we don't want to go down that road either, that kind of thing. But it's you know, I suppose over time, you know, I think this the populations have been going into the big cities. I think that's probably going to have to change longer term. We can't have everyone living in the city. You know, it just doesn't make sense from so many points of view.
You see the move. You know, like there is a substantial move from people from the city. You know, buying houses on the countryside, and it's like this. You know, sometimes it's a kind of like a picture. It's too much of the romantic picture of like, oh, living in the countryside. But I think there is something in people, especially when you're spending a few years in the city. I'm speaking from my own experience. You know, I was born and raised in the city, and then you go to the countryside and you look at it and you just and you just like, oh, this is better.
Yeah. No, like I always found it was like, as you're saying, asking the question about being optimistic or not. I always kind of was a bit stubborn about the fact that I felt that we needed to be able to, if I couldn't, you know, on a farm like this, if I couldn't make a living on a farm like this, and with all the education that I was given and everything else, that, you know, like the only thing I could do was farming. You know, I could just say if you had some kind of a welding business or something like that, it would be advantageous to be in a place where there's population. Whereas this kind of a business is the only one. I mean, maybe you could get some tourists out or whatever. That was losing its vibrancy over the years because more and more farmers were getting bigger and bigger and less people actually farming. And then you have not enough people in schools, and then everything falls apart. Then you've got small villages, like there's no local shop in our local village. This kind of stuff is like, I always was like, there's something wrong with the way we're doing it. Like all these people are going to the city, and these places out in the countryside are going backwards. It's like, that can't keep going on forever. How are we going to, like, are you going to be like the lads in Australia where they send their kids off 2 hours away to go to school? You know, like you have to have a little bit, you know, you can't be so far away from your food. And like, you know, it's something we didn't even touch on was bringing vegetables from other parts of the world.
Yeah.
It's like, you do need, the likes of vegetables, you do need more hands around there for picking vegetables and that, you know. But like, when you're talking about these big machine, you know, operations that are so specialist that they have to grow a particular one crop or 500 acres of one particular crop, their machine might cost 2 million or whatever it is. crazy stuff. And by the time it gets into your food basket, it could be 5-7 days old.
Yes.
As against if I was able to grow it in my own garden, you know, or more locally. Like, obviously, look, this is a price issue too, because these vegetables have been brought in for so cheap. It doesn't pay anyone to grow their own vegetables, really, as such. But, you know, we still need to do that because, you know, if the vegetables you're buying in, or fruits or whatever, are able to withstand going on a boat or going on a plane and lasting that amount of time, and maybe they could be getting sprayed with something or other. It's like, you know, does anyone know what's actually happening to those vegetables in the meantime? And if they're able to withstand that, that means they have to be kind of more woody or something, you know, like even an apple an apple that bruises easily is the one you want to pick straight off the tree and eat it.
Yeah.
It's probably the nicest apple you get, but that's not going to last on a truck going off. And
the people don't know that apples are being sprayed with the chemicals, and the reason they're so shiny in the shop is that there's actually chemical put on them.
Yeah,
like, the apples are not shiny by default.
Yeah, and I don't even eat any apples anymore much, because I always found them too hard. Just didn't like them. You know, I didn't like this big hard bite into them. And you know, it's only when you do a bit more research, when you're trying to grow a few of your own ones, most of the nicest ones are softer than that. But obviously they're more prone to diseases and things probably. But and maybe they're not, maybe not diseases, but just they won't take the travel in the commercial orchards or whatever. So, you know, kind of gets back to growing more local stuff if possible.
No, you're right. Like a transport and the shelf life. These are the things that are really killing food. They're killing like a good quality food.
Yeah, and it's I suppose if you're to think ahead, I think there's a lot of opportunities for farmers to start growing the things in Ireland that we can grow in Ireland that aren't being now, that are imported now. So, like, I think 90% of our apples are brought in from outside. Now, look, I mean, obviously it still has to be done commercially or some description, but you know, there has to be opportunities there. There has to be.
Yeah.
But it may not be through a supermarket. There might be other ways around it.
Yeah.
But there has to be. And look, when is it going to come the day that just say, look, you know, the Russian Ukraine war is happening now, but it could be a war somewhere else, and we don't get the flow of food from some part of the world that we were used to, and then we just don't have it because no one's growing it here. But you know, I mean, we're not going to get bananas in, but I don't think the climate's good enough for bananas or oranges.
Who knows? Like a few more years.
Look, you wouldn't know. But yeah.
Yeah, I get it. No, I get what you're saying, James. Listen, any final words of wisdom for our listeners? You know, people who are listening who might be farmers or might not be farmers. If you want, you may do two, like for non-farmers and for farmers. Words of wisdom, whichever way you want it. Words of wisdom. Jeez, I don't know. I'm stuck for answers now. For farmers, I'd say, look, from what we're doing, the likes of what we're doing with the multi-species swards, I'd just say get out onto another farmer's place that's growing them and ask them questions, and don't just accept everything you're hearing in the farming press or whatever. Just ask farmers and do a little bit more digging, because there's so much information out there. Like, it mightn't be landing in your newspaper every week, but there is information out there, only to look for it. The same probably goes for consumers of milk and meat and whatever, and vegetables. You know, they're probably, like, there is, I know we get some local meat from a pig producer who's outdoor pigs, and you know, it's locally done, like, and you know, Newbard Farm, I suppose. You know, they're a small setup at the moment, but like, you know, meeting the farmer that grows the food for you is
it's nice, you know. It's nice for the farmer and for the person eating it, like to know that they produced it. And there's no hiding place then as to what was done to the, you know, like we're saying about vegetables and different things. Like, you know, if you're getting it locally of someone, you know all these things aren't on them, all these sprays and different things. And it's not necessarily about having to be organic or not, you know. Just the fact that it's more local will mean there's less chemicals on it, less you know, less waste in driving the stuff here, there, and everywhere. And you know, it's nice to buy local stuff as well, and it's actually very hard to buy it local.
Yes.
If you're actually trying to make your dinner every day from something that was within 30 miles of the place, you'd have a job. You know, and that's aside from biscuits and all the crap that we shouldn't be eating at all.
No, it's like I was like when the village butcher closed near where I live, it was like, oh my God, where am I going to get meat now? And you know, it was just uncomparable. You can go, you know, even like this thing, you go in, you have a chat, you know, what you have, you know, you have like, you know, in the season you have a venison, and like you said, you have some pork and beef from the small operators. It was pretty like you felt more connected to what you're eating. And then when, you know, shortly before COVID, he closed his shop, and I was like, oh my God, I guess I now need to go to the supermarket. And you're just like, it's not the same. Yeah,
like, I mean, you know, we don't have any hens now because foxes and dogs and stuff don't really like our hens. But just producing your own few eggs and giving them to your folks, your family, and what have you, and like, we weren't selling them or anything like that, but it's you get more joy out of that than you know, than sending stuff off in a lorry load and never meeting anyone, you know. And when they come back and they tell you, God, they liked the eggs, they were lovely, or whatever, you know, whether it's a little drop of milk or whatever. And my wife used to be making pesto and different things in the local village until we had the kids. And you know, you get feedback from that, and it's a two-way thing. Like, those people want to eat local and they want to buy stuff from local people, but it's just not there for them. And it's nice to get feedback as well, and you know, it's usually nicer. I mean, you know, the pesto, for example, like selling it for €5 or €6 maybe, you can get pesto in Tesco or wherever for like €1, you know. But it's, you'd still buy the €5 stuff because the other stuff is crap, you know. You know, it's long life stuff, it would last forever. You know, a problem with making stuff in your own house or whatever is you've shelf life problems, that if you want it to last a long time, you're going to have to use all these preservatives and different things that aren't going to really add to the flavour at all. They're probably going to make it worse. And so these things have to be eaten locally reasonably quickly. And but that's a problem with the whole food system, I suppose. Yeah, you know. But yeah.
Listen, thank you for that. It's been a pleasure, and I'm really glad to hear optimistic views about farming. So yeah, listen, I wish you all the best and good luck with what you're doing, and we probably should do it again and see where you are.
Yeah, it could go any direction. Yeah, I didn't think we were going to end up going the directions we went, but yeah, no, look, I mean, there's a lot to talk about in farming, and you know, it'd be my pleasure to talk to you again.
All right, thank you.
All right.